Hello guys, so today I'm going to be doing my presentation on seclusion and restraints. So first I'm going to start with the introduction. So Garaci et al. 2013 stated that the definition of restraints is an intervention used for emergencies that prevent self-harm or someone else from being harmed and is a last resort tactic. Huxhorn et al. 2014 stated that seclusion is when a person is forced to be in a room all by themselves and they are prevented from leaving. So there are three common types of restraints, and those are physical, mechanical, and chemical. And then there's just seclusion. So my stance on this subject is that seclusion and restraint are used far too often in the field, and this needs to be changed. And one of the reasons I think this needs to be changed is because after reading all of these articles, it seems that the negatives seem to outweigh the good, especially on the grand scale. And one of the reasons for this is that the people that are trained to do restrictive interventions have limited training. So therefore they're kind of left to their own devices to do as they please, and then they end up abusing the restrictive interventions, which can end up leading to people getting injured or sometimes even dying. So now what I'm going to do is go over some ethical guidelines that Bailey and Birch covered in the ethics book that we went over in class. So the first guideline that this research reminded me of was 2.10b, which is the right to an effective treatment. Now, after reading some of these articles, it seems as though using restraints and seclusion can be appropriate at times, and when it is used appropriately, then it's not harmful to the client. But it seems that most of the time it is not used appropriately and therefore might not always be the most effective treatment. Now, it seems as though seclusion and restraint should not be used solely as a treatment. It should be used as kind of something to add on to existing treatments. Now, something that I would hope for is that it will be used in conjunction with another kind of intervention, such as a positive intervention. And it should be used as a last resort, like I said before. And we need to try to be using evidence-based interventions where the good outweigh the bad, which is something that I don't really see happening with restraints and seclusion. And then the second guideline that this research reminded me of was 3.02, and this was using functional assessments. Now, I would hope that before researchers began using restraints and seclusion on people, they did functional assessments to ensure that, let's say, the client isn't engaging in problem behaviors to escape. Because if so, then using restraints and seclusion could actually be reinforcing to this person. So I think it's very, very important for us to use functional assessments to determine what the function of the problem behavior is, and if it's escape, we need to try to use something else other than seclusion and restraints. And then the third guideline this reminded me of was 1.02, which is the guideline of competence. Now, I believe that this should apply to all the fields that use restraints and seclusion, like nursing and schooling and other fields such as that, because if the person that is doing the treatment of seclusion or restraints doesn't know what they're doing, then the likelihood of the client being harmed is greater, which is what we're trying to avoid. Moving on to the history. So Harkin 2014 says that it is difficult to determine the prevalence of seclusion and restraints used. Now, one of the reasons for this that I read in another article is because there is not really a standardized definition of what seclusion and restraints is, so therefore different areas can use different definitions, which makes it very, very difficult to determine the prevalence if one jurisdiction is saying it's one thing and the other is saying it's something different. So Harkin also says that most institutions have laws that regulate restrictive interventions except for schools. Now, I found this to be very interesting and kind of disturbing in a way, because you would think that we would want schools to be very safe for our children, especially if they have behavior issues or intellectual disabilities. So I found that was very surprising that there aren't any federal laws, as Eckes said in 2014, that schools don't really have any federal laws that discuss the use of restraints and seclusion in schools, which I also thought was kind of bothersome. Now, Eckes did describe some efforts that the government has been doing to get federal laws put into place, but it seems as though the Senate and the House don't really agree on things, which needs to change if we want to kind of be able to use seclusion and restraints positively in the school setting. Moving on to a few of the court cases regarding this subject. First one was Muskrat versus Deer Creek Public School in 2013. So basically the premise of this was that a student was in a desk restraint and would be put in a timeout room, and this student was receiving services from IDEA or IDEA. So the parents were upset with the student being put in the desk restraints and the use of the timeout room, but the result of his court case was that the judge decided not to punish a school because the parents couldn't prove that the school was doing inhumane behaviors, and the judge decided that the school was simply careless in their actions. Now for Ebony S. versus Pueblo School District 60, 2012. This case was basically about a mother and a daughter, and the daughter was allegedly kept at a desk using restraints. Now the mother thought that this violated her daughter's 4th and 14th Amendment rights. But the case ended with the court deciding that the school was not at fault because the student could remove the restraints on the desk at any time, and the mother also could not prove that her daughter's 4th Amendment rights were violated. For TW versus the School Board of Seminole County 2010, this also was about a teacher and a parent. Now, the teacher would use force on a student, and the student had intellectual disabilities and autism. But similar to the other court cases, the teacher was not charged because there is no proof that the school treated the student with the disabilities differently, and the student only had minor bruises, and these were not excessive in nature. And although the teacher did put her full body weight in order to restrict the child from moving, this was not deemed to be abuse because it was contingent on the student's misconduct. Now, Eckes ended this paper by saying that most cases will end up in the favor of the school as long as the school can prove that the restraint use was not biased or unreasonable. And then another court case that Perlin covered was Coltrane versus Pitt County Memorial Hospital. Now for this one, basically a man was supposed to be put into restraints, and it was left up to a nurse to put the restraints on him, but the nurse was not trained to do this. So the man ended up going up on a windowsill and falling off and dying from the fall. Now the hospital won this case as well because there was no proof that the man's death was due to him not being in restraints, and the prosecution could not prove that the hospital had been negligent. Now, these court cases kind of bothered me, obviously, because I would think that if a child comes home with bruises, that the school should be held accountable. I would think that if this was a normal public school and a child came home with a bruise and the child reported that the teachers or another faculty member did it, then the school will be, charged. So I found it very interesting that these schools, specialty schools and hospitals, were not held responsible for their actions. Moving on to research. So according to Huxhorn et al. 2014, there is a regulatory language that facilities will use to determine when to use seclusion and restraint, but this language tends to be subjective and therefore is difficult to systematically implement. Now it's interesting, as I've said before, that the field of behavior analysis, along with other fields in the medicine world, continue to use restraints and seclusion with the popularity that it has when there's not very much scientific proof that the benefits outweigh the harm. Now, the use of restraints and seclusion is not all bad. because one study by Sapani et al. 2017 stated that pairing restraint with positive behavior methods like FCT will reduce the problem behaviors more than just using the positive behavior method alone. Also, Sapani suggested that it is important to use the functional analyses to help determine what the function of a problem behavior is. Now, he hypothesized most of these, but he decided that if the function of behavior is escape, that restraints may reduce the number of times the client can injure themselves, but that the client will still get to escape the aversive activity. With attention maintained, with behaviors that are maintained by attention, restraints will extinguish this because they will prolong the time before the client can receive the wanted attention. And with behaviors maintained by automatic reinforcers, Sapani was split on this and decided that response blocking can either cause extinction or punishment. Now, Weber et al. In 2011 conducted a study in Victoria, Australia to kind of see what methods of restraint and seclusion those facilities would use. Now, 95% of the clients who did receive a form of restraint received a chemical restraint, which will most of the time be medications, and the most common type of medication used were atypical antipsychotics. And chemical restraints were primarily used to reduce the harm to oneself and others. And with mechanical restraints, the most common forms would be bodysuits, belts, and gloves, and these were primarily used to prevent self-harm. Continuing with Weber's study, seclusion was primarily used after instances of the client harming another person. And with the clientele, the most common pairs of interventions given to people were chemical and mechanical restraints or seclusion and chemical restraints. Now, the population of people that received more than one type of restrictive interventions tended to have a combination of intellectual disability, autism, psychiatric illness, and some other type of speech impairment. Now, Weber also looked at age and sex and determined that young males with more than one disability are more likely to experience some type of restrictive intervention. So to summarize, seclusion and restraints used appropriately can benefit people and create a safer environment for everyone. Most of the time, restrictive interventions are not used correctly and can result in injuries or even death. So I believe that as workers in human services, we should be competent in what we are doing, provide the best treatments, and always remember to do no harm to the people that we are trying to help. Now, this research kind of reminded me of the Stanford prison experiment because, like, the officers wouldn't really have anyone that would kind of be overseeing what they were doing. So, as we saw, the officers began to abuse their powers. Now, the staff in these facilities, like, they do seem to have someone that oversees what they do, but at the same time they seem to also run the show, and this might explain why there's so much abuse and neglect when it comes to using restrictive interventions. Now, there needs to be intensive staff and parent training if we want to continue to use restraints and seclusion in facilities and institutions. We also need to create federal laws for restrictive interventions in schools. And we need to decrease the overall use of restrictive interventions and increase the positive behavioral interventions that we use. So I'd like to thank everybody for watching my video, and I hope you guys have a great day. Thank you.